Well, guys, I'm Cameron, and we are doing another edition of Capturing Christianity. We had a little bit of a scheduling mishap, so everybody's here now. We're ready to go. And tonight we have a very fun discussion planned on the ontological argument, which the name of it is actually a little bit scarier than it actually is, and we'll see that in the discussion today. So we have Graham Oppy, who's been on the show before, but we have he's not technically new. We've done an interview with him, Ben Arbour, and both of these guys are experts on the ontological argument, so it should be really interesting. My guest, Ben, holds a PhD from the University of Bristol, and he is an adjunct professor at Weatherford College. His philosophical research focuses on the intersection of analytic metaphysics, especially systematics and the nature of time, and Christian theology, particularly as these relate to Anselmian understandings of the doctrine of God. And Graham Oppy is professor of philosophy in the School of Philosophical, Historical, and International Studies at Monash University. And most of his recent publications have actually been in philosophy of religion. Now, Graham, you didn't always, when did your interest in philosophy of religion start? Because your dissertation was not about philosophy of religion at all. So when did that start?
Well, I guess my interest in philosophy of religion started long before I became a professional philosopher. I was interested in arguing about the existence of God when I was in high school. I had a bunch of friends and we used to argue a lot. The way that I fell into philosophy of religion professionally, though, did happen after my dissertation. After I finished my dissertation, I went to the ANU and I was actually hanging out in Canberra. I was unemployed, and an opportunity came up to teach a course in philosophy of religion at ANU, and I said that I could do that, and then I had to teach myself philosophy of religion in order to actually do it. And so that was how I got into philosophy of religion. And then a couple of years after that, I applied for a grant to write a book. It was going to be a book about Reformed epistemology, and it ended up just being a book about ontological arguments, because that was as far as I got. So I kind of got sidetracked. I was looking at planting as ontological argument, and I thought I'd write up some stuff on ontological arguments, and I didn't ever get back to writing the book that I'd originally planned to do.
Well, it's been said that William Lane Craig puts the fear of God into atheists, and I'm going to say that Graham Oppy puts the fear of no God into theists. Let's see how that comes across. Ben is at least laughing. Okay, so if you want to learn more about the guests, about Ben and about Graham, just go to the website capturingchristianity.com, and that's also where you'll find all of our social media links, Facebook, Twitter, as well as our podcast, which we use SoundCloud for that. And if you've been enjoying the content that we've been providing and working really diligently at, just go to patreon.com/capturingchristianity. We've got a couple cool things there. We started an early access model where you guys can get early access to articles and podcast episodes if you subscribe to the Patreon account. All right, so all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the discussion. So let's start with one of the most important questions that anyone can ask, which is, who is the best Batman? I think we have to answer that one before we get into the ontological argument. This is something that Ben requested. So, well, Ben, why don't you give your answer, and then we'll get Graham's. Who's the best Batman?
Oh, I think Christian Bale played the best Batman. And I think Christopher Nolan's trilogy really captures the spirit of The Dark Knight better than any of the other modern film renditions do.
Okay, Graham,
so I'm not very well qualified to answer this. I haven't seen any of the Batman movies. What I am familiar with is the television series from the 1960s, which was kind of a different genre altogether.
Yeah, Adam West, right? So.
Yeah, Adam West, exactly.
Well, fair enough.
That will have to be my answer.
Okay. Well, Adam West, he's still pretty cool. He's still a pretty cool guy. Okay. All right. Icebreaker out of the way. Let's just jump into it. And so with the ontological argument, the name itself is a little weird, right? I mean, ontological. So let's talk a little about definitions first. So let's define what the heck ontology means. Necessity, possibility, And then obviously we're interested in arguments about God, so we'll go ahead and define that too. So let's start with Ben, because Ben is going to be defending the ontological argument. Well, let's have a discussion about what ontology is first.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, just to clarify something, I've heard several times you talk about the ontological argument, and I think that's a little bit of a misnomer. I think that there are a dozen or so renditions of different versions of ontological arguments, and there are a great many of them that I don't think are successful, but there are a couple that I think are really interesting and worth thinking about. But the ontological argument is an argument for the existence of God from the nature of the thing in question. So I think ontology is sometimes used synonymously with metaphysics, but in the particular way that we're going to be using it here, I would define ontology as a subset of metaphysics, where metaphysics is the study of reality, and ontology is the study of what there is, and the study of the nature of the things that are, and what makes them what they are. And I don't mean what makes them in a causal sense of what the cause of those things are, although that's a very important question and certainly related to some of this. But I mean the nature of what a thing is in virtue of the properties that those things have and the way in which they have the properties that they have. So, you know, the ontology of a table, you might say, is interesting to think about. Does a table necessarily have 4 legs? Well, probably not, because you can clearly think of tables that only have 3 legs. But do tables need to have legs at all? Isn't it possible that you could have a table that just lays on the floor? So those are kinds of some of the questions that you might think about asking if you were doing the ontology of tables, which would just be a subset of ontology in general. So just to restate, I think ontology is a subset of metaphysics, at least in the way that I intend to use that word in this discussion. I don't know if Graham will find those definitions amenable or if he would suggest alternative understandings.
Okay, so I'm happy with the idea that ontology is part of metaphysics. So ontological questions are just some of the metaphysical questions. I'm not sure that the label ontological, as it occurs in ontological argument, is a very good label. It happens to be the label that Kant chose. But Kant himself thought that the argument that he was picking out was an a priori argument. That's what he thought was distinctive about it. All the premises were knowable a priori, and he contrasted that with cosmological and teleological arguments where you needed to have some empirical data to work with. It might have been better if he, I mean, there are reasons why he wouldn't have gone this way, historical as well as sort of the connotations. It might have been better to call it the ideological argument rather than the ontological argument, because his idea was that it started with the idea or the concept of God, and somehow or other you got from there to there actually being something that corresponded to the idea or the concept.
Did you have any additional thoughts there, Ben?
Yeah, well, I mean, historically, I do think that it's interesting and important that we talk about the distinction between a priori arguments for the existence of God and a posteriori arguments for the existence of God. And then, of course, in Kant, you have the whole idea of whether or not there could be a synthetic a priori, or whether all a priori truths are analytic in nature. And I mean, like the way that all this gets teased out in the history of philosophy from Kant forward and into Hegel and Schopenhauer, and then the early analytic term, you know, can get very interesting. I'm not primarily interested in my own research in some of the historical matters as much as I am in appropriating them. And so here's what I mean by that. I consider myself Anselmian, meaning that the ideas that we find in Anselm, I think, are right. But I'm less interested in what Anselm thought per se, as I am in appropriating ideas. And I just want to clarify real quickly what I mean by this. In a lot of contemporary analytic philosophy of religion and analytic theology, you'll find that there are discussions between multiple people who are talking about various ideas. And Graham will be very familiar with this in terms of Kant. So there are people who want to appropriate Kantian ideas. And then there's oftentimes separate discussions about who properly exegetes Kant, right? So there's on the one hand, who understands Kant qua Kant. And then there's the second understanding of who rightly understands how we can appropriate Kantian ideas in terms of us trying to utilize them to make sense of these secondary puzzles. So at least as I want to talk about ontological arguments, I am much less concerned with fidelity to the original meaning of Anselm in Anselm's arguments, or Descartes in Cartesian ontological arguments, or any of the other great thinkers, Spinoza, Leibniz, or Hartshorne, or even Plantinga himself, as I am. Let's have a discussion about those ideas. And even if we are utilizing those ideas in ways that are a bit different than the way that Plantinga would use them, it can still be fruitful for us to have a dialogue about themes that are in the same neighborhood, if you will.
Okay, so can I add something to that? I mean, my attitude is very similar to that, but I would say the same thing about arguments, the arguments themselves. I'm interested in, so we write down an argument, we've got a bunch of premises and a conclusion, and we evaluate that argument. And then we write down another one, which may be only slightly different, and we evaluate it. All that's up for evaluation is the arguments. And then there's a whole lot of considerations that bear on determining whether particular arguments are good ones or not. And it's very similar to your thought. I'm not particularly concerned about what other people said about these arguments. Say, imagine that you extract an argument from Anselm. I'm not that interested in what people said about it over the sort of that, whatever it is, 1,900 and something years since Anselm produced his argument. I'm interested in what we should say about it now.
Yeah, so I'm very much in agreement with you about that. So just to restate this for the audience, I'm not interested in debating Graham about, wait, that's not what Anselm meant when he said that, or that's not what Kant meant when he articulated such and such. I'm more interested in talking about the ideas themselves. And I do appreciate that there is an important distinction, therefore, in what I would call Anselmian ontological arguments, as opposed to Anselm's ontological arguments. Because I don't think there's just one ontological argument in the Proslogion. I think there's multiple. But I'm not interested in Anselm's arguments per se. I'm interested in the ideas of perfect being theology and the way that they work themselves out, particularly in the context of contemporary analytic metaphysics and the metaphysics of modality and some of those things. And
yeah, well, speaking of modality, I think it'd be important to define what we mean in the in this context when we say something is necessary or something is possible. So why don't we talk a little about that before we get into like whether or not the possibility premise is true. Let's talk about possibility for a second and what the kind of possibility that we have in mind, that kind of thing.
Well, let's let Graham start this time.
Okay.
Okay, so it's common for philosophers to distinguish between different kinds of modalities, different kinds of possibilities, and different kinds of necessities. And I'll assume, though maybe it's something else that could be debated, that necessity and possibility are just interdefined. So if something's possible, then it's not necessary that it's not the case. If something's necessary, then it's not possible that it's not the case. So given either one, we can define the other, no matter what kind of modality we're talking about. So some people think that there's a logical modality. Some people think that there's something different from that, that's an ontological or metaphysical modality. Most people accept that there's a different something else, which you might call something like epistemic modality, and there are other things other kinds of modality that you might distinguish as well, and it's controversial and tricky to distinguish between these different modalities, to say exactly how they differ, and then you get disagreements about whether really we've got use for all of them, whether we can collapse some of them, and so on. So I'm thinking that when we're talking about ontological arguments, we really should be thinking about a kind of ontological modality, but I'm not sure that that's different from what other people call logical modality. So here's really how it goes. What's necessary is what's true no matter what, and then you get from that by the interdefinition to what possibility is. So that's a very kind of brief introduction to modality that Ben might want to add to.
Yeah, okay. So I don't think there's much there that you've said that I disagree with. I would just want to try to put a little more meat on the bone. I recognize a distinction between what we might call broadly logical possibility or narrowly logical possibility. And I do agree with you that possibility and necessity and impossibility are all related concepts to one another within each respective modality that we're talking about. So in our conversation, I expect that I'll make use of terms like modal landscape. And when I'm talking about a modal landscape, I'm talking about one of these particular varieties of modality. And I'm talking about the nature of what is necessarily true respective to that modality, what is contingently true respective to that modality, what is contingently false respective to the modality, and what is necessarily false respective to that modality. And of course, to say that something is necessarily false is just to say that it's impossible with respect to that modality. So a type of modality that you didn't mention that I think is very important is nomological modality. So what is possible or what is necessary or impossible given a particular understanding of the laws of nature. So broadly logical, narrowly logical, metaphysical, nomological, and epistemic modalities are all very important. Now, I have one other thing I want to say, but I just want to check with you, Graham. Is there anything that I said there that you find problematic?
Not really. I guess for nomological modality, I wouldn't restrict it to laws of nature. I mean, you might think that there are laws of metaphysics or something like that, and the nomological might extend that far.
Yeah, perhaps, especially if one thinks that, you know, various metaphysical laws are contingent. You know, if you think that they're necessary, then likely, if you're somebody like me and you think that the laws of logic are necessary, then there's going to be a certain amount of overlap between metaphysical necessity and logical necessity. But those are all like very, very tricky fields that we could get lost in the weeds and fail to have a good conversation about the ontological argument. We just get weighed down in unnecessary disagreements about those particulars.
Yeah, so it's worth pointing out that I guess I'm inclined to think that the laws of nature are necessary, but that's going to be irrelevant to the discussion that we're about to have.
Okay. Well, since you brought it up, I'm not inclined to share that agreement, but I tend to agree with you that I don't think that that's going to be particularly germane to our discussion this evening, or for you in the afternoon there. By the way, hello to Australia. Go Go ahead, Cameron.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because we're about 20 minutes in already, and so why don't we try to jump into the argument a little bit? And well,
give me 3 more minutes then to clarify something that's very important related to this.
Go ahead.
So my understanding of all of these metaphysical, all of these modal terms that we're going to be using throughout the debate relates to a particular understanding of the way in which all those things work, which is a traditional semantics of what we call possible worlds. And I think that possible worlds are maximally consistent states of affairs. So you can think about the way that the world is, the actual world, okay, which, as I will be using the actual world, I'll consistently try to refer to the actual world by the name alpha. So alpha is the actual world. But we can think about the way that the world might have been or could have been if it had been different, if we think that there are any contingent truths. And so we can describe a state of affairs that might be fairly similar to the actual world, but with a few relevant differences. And we can describe it also as a maximally consistent state of affairs. So there's nothing that's logically contradictory about these kinds of worlds. And we could just call them beta or gamma or delta or something else, just to distinguish them from alpha. Now, within that very standard semantics of possible worlds, which is quite common in the literature, this is the way that David Armstrong talks about possible worlds as states of affairs. It's consistent with the way that Alvin Plantinga has talked about possible worlds, and consistent even with the way that David Lewis talked about possible worlds, except for the way that he uses the term actual. But that's not germane to what's going on here. I want to introduce the language of possible worlds so that we can now clarify what we mean when we say that something is necessarily true, or if we say that something is contingently true, or to say that something is possible but not necessary, or to say that something is impossible. So when you think about all of the different possible worlds that there are, all of them, if we say that something is necessarily true, then whatever proposition that we're talking about, if to say that that proposition is necessarily true is to say that that proposition is true in every possible world. To say that something is contingently true is to say that there is at least one possible world in which that proposition is not true. And to say that a proposition is impossible is to say that there are 0 possible worlds in which that proposition is true. So that's the way that I'm going to use these modal terms of possibility, contingency, necessity, and impossibility. It's all within the framework of possible worlds semantics.
Graham, do you have anything to add there?
Not really. And I think that you can talk either way. You can either frame your arguments in terms of the modal operators, it's possibly the case that it's necessarily the case that it's contingent that, and so on. Or you can frame your arguments in terms of talk about possible worlds. So what's true in all possible worlds, true in some, true in none. I think you have to be careful that you don't mix the two types of talk together, because that, although it's sort of not obvious on its face, I think that we're going to assume that the modal logic, if we were doing it in the framework of just the standard modal operators, will be S5, in which case iterated modalities just collapse. So it's necessary that it's necessary just reduces to it's necessary, and so on. And if you start saying things like it's necessary that in all possible worlds, you're just introducing these redundant operators in effect. The other thing I wanted to say is that there is some question about whether it's exactly true that there's that you're not adding anything when you move to talk about possible worlds as opposed to working with the traditional modal operators. There was a debate that lasted through much of the 70s that began when one of my old teachers noted that the expressive power of modal language, of the possible worlds language, seems to be greater than the expressive power of the traditional boxes and diamonds, necessity and possibility, that there are propositions that you can formulate when you talk about possible worlds that don't readily translate into talk about boxes and diamonds. There's eventually that, I think, debate gets resolved. It probably doesn't matter for today's purposes exactly how it gets resolved, but we should just be careful when we're formulating the arguments that we're going to talk about, that we're consistent in our use of one vocabulary or the other.
Very good. So I am 100% in agreement about the importance of being consistent in our vocabulary. Just for clarification, a moment ago you mentioned S5, and I take it from the context of your comment that you think that S5 is a system of modal logic that already incorporates S4 into it, because the example that you gave talked about necessarily it is necessary, and you would pop off that operator not by S5 but by S4.
Yeah.
But presumably, since I just heard you bring it up, if you're comfortable with S5, this would also mean that you're comfortable with the modal operators, that if it is possible that it is necessary, then we can pop off the external operator and move from the possibility of the necessity strictly to the necessity. So you're comfortable with accessibility relations between worlds as well?
Yeah, so I'm happy to say, let's have a discussion taking for granted that the logic that we're using is S5.
Okay, good.
And so we're going to assume that every possible world is accessible from every other possible world.
Right.
And let's proceed on that basis.
Yeah.
There are arguments to be had about whether S5 is the correct modal logic, but again, let's just leave that for a different day.
Well, I'm happy to leave it for a different day, but I do want to just say two more things about that, and then maybe we can actually move on to the ontological argument itself. I'm deeply persuaded by arguments that have recently been put forward by Joshua Rasmussen and Alexander Pruss in favor of S5. Their recent book, Necessary Existence, I've found difficult but rewarding to read, and I mean difficult in the sense that it's taxing and demands 100% of your attention. So I would be happy to defend S5 if we needed to, and along some of the same lines that they did. They've done some fantastic research there. But also, I don't think that you need S5 in order to have successful modal ontological arguments. I think that you can have successful modal ontological arguments on systems B or T, provided that you have accessibility relations between worlds. And I think that you can get those on lesser modal logics than S5. But again, this might be unnecessary to sort of the broader conversation that we want to have about ontological arguments today.
I think that's right. There's a literature that discusses what's the minimal logic that you need in order to run a modal ontological argument, and it's quite weak. It just simplifies discussion, since I'm kind of not interested in pursuing any of that, to just move it to one side.
Great. All right. Wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah. So Ben, go ahead and take the floor. Let's get into your version, or one of the versions that you think is a successful, good, interesting modal ontological argument. And then I'll try to stop along the way if I get lost or if I need any clarification. And then we'll move into sort of Graham's response, objections, and then from there we may have some time toward the end to take some questions from the audience viewing, you guys right there. So yeah, so go ahead, Ben, take it away.
Well, I'm disappointed to let everybody watching know that I also had some technological difficulties earlier, and I had a few slides, but my computer's microphone wasn't working, so I had to jump on a different computer. So just for the purposes of our discussion, I'll try to simplify things because I don't have the equivalent of a handout to put up on the screen. But I think that there are versions of Plantinga's modal ontological argument that are not only valid, but might be sound. And I just say might be because I just want to be very clear from the onset that I don't think that people who reject ontological arguments are morons or fools. I know that there are a great many apologists who kind of think that, and I would just be like to one one person who speaks up on behalf of Christianity and says that's not the right way to think about these things. So Plantinga's ontological argument in its simplest form just goes like this: possibly God exists, therefore God exists. Now, it's a little more complicated than that. He thinks that maximal greatness is a property that entails, excuse me, I'm going to get maximal greatness and maximal excellence confused here, but maximal greatness is the property of being omnipotent and omniscient and omnibenevolent. And I will use the terms omnibenevolent and morally perfect interchangeably in our discussion. And, you know, a maximally excellent being is any being that has maximal greatness in every possible world. It's possible that there is a being that exemplifies maximal excellence, and now I'm quite certain that I have reversed greatness and excellence as Plantinga used the terms. I'm sorry about that.
It's okay. I think we'll forgive you.
Thank you. But the idea here is that if it is possible that there is a being that is maximally great in every possible world, then what you're saying is that a being is maximally great necessarily. And if any being is maximally great necessarily, then it is maximally great in all possible worlds. And if it is maximally great in all possible worlds, then it's certainly maximally great in the actual world. And therefore, it follows that this being who is maximally great exists in the actual world. And it all hinges, I'm certain that Graham and I are going to be in agreement on this, that the success or the failure of this argument, everything hinges on whether this one premise is true or false. And it's the possibility premise. Either it is possible that God exists or not. And that's where everything hinges. And built into the whole concept of God is this notion of maximal excellence, and maximal excellence means maximal greatness in all, or maximal greatness means maximal excellence in all possible worlds, and so it all kind of works out from there. So that is at least the structure of the argument that I want to put on the table, and I'm not saying that I want to just leave it there, because there are some things that I would want to modify, but that's the argument, and at least the logical form that I'm most interested in right now.
So Graham, are you in agreement with him that you agree that the most controversial premise there is the possibility premise, that first possibility premise?
So the way that the argument was first formulated, there was just one premise: possibly God exists, so God exists. Obviously, putting the argument like that enthymematic, you had to fill out some missing bits, and there is going to be at least one other premise that tells you something about God. A kind of simple thing that you can fill in is necessarily, if God exists, then it's necessary that God exists, which is one of Hartshorne's favorite ways of filling out the argument. And we can grant, okay, what we're interested in here is the idea that if there is a God, then God's a necessarily existent being, and there's various ways that you might justify that, thinking, for example, that if God exists, then God's got to be that than which no greater can be conceived, and it will follow from that God exists necessarily, or God's a maximally perfect being, and so it follows from that God's got to exist necessarily, or whatever. Accepting that that's, for now, that we can just agree that we're going to talk about a necessarily existent God, then yes, there's really only this other, the one other premise is that it's possible that God exists. So that's where all the action is going to be in discussing the argument. You can, well, maybe that's enough. I'll let Ben say some more before I say anything further.
Well, maybe it would be worthwhile for us to explore the other possibility there, you know, before we dive in, because it sounds like we're in agreement. But let's just consider the alternative for a moment, that God is not a necessarily existent being. Yeah. That would mean that if there was a God, that God would be a contingent being. Now, if anything is a contingent being, then it is contingent upon something. And I would just think that any God that is contingent upon any other thing for its existence is no God at all. That's just not. I don't know of any. And this might be a bit strong to say, but I don't know of any theologian who represents anything akin to any Abrahamic faith or anything in the Western philosophical tradition who would be comfortable talking about a God that is contingent upon something else for its existence.
Okay, so I can't speak for the theologians, but Richard Swinburne is a philosopher who's supposed that God doesn't exist of necessity. What I think he'll dispute is the idea that just because God's contingent, there's something that God depends upon. Rather, the idea will be, I'm sure, that there's a kind of brute contingency. So in some possible worlds, what you've got as a kind of brute initial existence is God. In other possible worlds, as a brute initial existence, you've got something that doesn't, in which God plays no part. And so because they're brute contingencies, they don't depend on anything, right? That I'm sure would be the picture that Swinburne's got when he says that he doesn't accept that God exists of necessity.
Well, I'm not sure that that's what Richard means. And I have dialogued with him fairly recently about this matter in depth over multiple days. Richard's latest work on the subject, he thinks that God self-causes, that he's causa sui. And I'm not inclined to agree with that understanding of the divine being. But Richard is reticent to say that God is necessary, at least in a logical sense, because he's worried that that entails the idea that the sentence, "there is no God," is incoherent. And he doesn't think that that statement is incoherent. I'm inclined to say that it might be incoherent, given my understanding of this. But it more so has to do with my linking of these terms like necessity and contingency and impossibility to a particular understanding of possible worlds. To say that God is a contingent being is to say that there is at least one possible world in which God does not exist. To say that God is a necessary being is to say that there are no worlds in which it is true that God does exist. That's the right way to think about it, or so it seems to me, just given the whole idea of God that we have. So there's one way to think about this, but there's another way to think about it. I don't think that there can be such a thing as brute contingents. I'm okay with certain necessary truths just being brute, but the idea of a brute contingent just seems to me to violate even very weak articulations of the principle of sufficient reason. And I would just articulate that as the following thesis, that for anything that is contingent, there's an explanation for its truth. And if you say that the explanation of contingent truth is that it just is that way, it's just brute, that's not much of an explanation. That seems to cry out for more understanding. So and if that's the place where we agree to disagree, then okay, that's fine. But I would just want to get clear for the audience that part of what's motivating my reasoning about some of these things is commitment to at least a weak articulation of the principle of sufficient reason, which seems to rule out the idea that there can be brute contingents. And on that basis, it seems like we're pushed in a direction, at least if you're a theist, to think that God is a necessary being.
Okay, so that's quite interesting. I wonder whether, if you're a theist, you will be able to avoid brute contingencies unless you go with Leibniz and suppose that everything's necessary. And the reason is because we have God in a whole lot of different possible worlds making different universes. And if we ask why in one world God makes this universe and in another world God makes a different universe, it's going to be something to do with the way that God's set up, because there's something different that's happening across the worlds. And it looks like that's just got to be some kind of brute contingency. Right? So I think that that if you're going to have contingency, some of it's going to be brute. I also think this doesn't matter for today's discussion. This is for really relevant to discussions about cosmological arguments, not about ontological arguments.
Well, okay, so that's interesting, because part of the way that I would want to motivate some of the possibility premises of ontological arguments is going to involve appealing to a posteriori arguments. But the response that you just gave about brute contingencies seems to, at least in the background, maybe there's a worry of what are known as modal collapse arguments. And I think that there's been some recent work done on those puzzles, especially those who are worried about modal collapse arguments. A rather young analytic theologian my age named Ryan Mullins, who has done some really fascinating work. He has been somebody who's published raising worries of modal collapse. And I think that there have been some important responses to his work and other worries about modal collapse from a fellow by the name of Christopher Tomaszewski, who is a PhD student at Baylor University. And I'm persuaded that a lot of our worries about modal collapse are ill-founded. At least Van Inwagen's articulations of modal collapse on the basis of PSR have been responded to by Chris, as have Ryan Mullins. So again, I'm happy to say we don't necessarily need to explore this a whole lot more. But I think there's been some recent work that allays some of those fears.
Well, Ben, and couldn't we also just sort of limit the PSR even further down? So like you just said, all contingent facts. Well, that I'm assuming that's sort of what you were alluding to there. All contingency. But, and I think this is in that same book, in Necessary Existence, that Alexander Proust and Joshua Rasmussen just put out, is that we can limit the PSR to, instead of being about all contingent facts, we can limit it to just be about contingent things. And so if this being acts in a certain way, that's different than whether or not it just sort of exists as a brute fact. And so we could limit the PSR in that way, and we'd still need an explanation for the being itself, even if we granted that its actions were sort of random or brute or whatever. The thing itself, for no reason at all.
Yeah, you know, there's a lot of debate amongst theologians and philosophers or whether God is a being or whether God is that which is beyond being. And in a couple of talks that I've given, I've just let people know that I'm at least aware of and somewhat sympathetic to Thomistic worries, that all this talk about God being a being just kind of makes God a glorified thing, like the creature than which none greater can be conceived. But part of what we're trying to drive at when we're talking about the whole notion of God is something that's beyond that, something that transcends. Nonetheless, it doesn't really seem to me that we have a lot of way of talking about God as a being, unless we just talk about God as a being. And maybe that's analogical reasoning. I'm not saying that it is necessarily univocal. So for those who are worried about that, I would just say I'm happy to put a big asterisk before everything that I'm saying today and say analogically, maybe this is the right way to think about it, because that's the only caution that I would want to say about even thinking about modifying PSR to only be quantifying over things, and then God is one of those things, and so we just need to make sure that we can talk about that, because maybe it's not right to just quantify over God as though God is a thing. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, it seems to me that Graham is sort of okay with the thought that necessary existence is a perfection, or if you're not necessarily okay with it, it doesn't seem like you have a whole lot of maybe objection toward it. I don't know. But why don't you, Graham, give some of your thoughts over the discussion that Ben and I sort of had there, and then let's try to move back to discussing that possibility premise, because I think that's where really the meat of the disagreement lies.
Right.
Okay, so on the question about, well, it's a nest of questions about being able to speak univocally of God and whether God's a being and so on. When we formulate the argument, it's got a name in it, and you might think that it's a name, unless it's an empty name, it refers. I'm not going to say anything about the category that it refers to, just the name refers, right? And that's enough, right? Now I don't have to worry about, I don't have to worry about all the rest of the background worries that you've got if you go on and suppose that it's problematic to talk about God as a being or whatever. Right? I'm just leaving it completely open. Otherwise, we've got a problem with interpreting the possibility premise and the conclusion. Right? We've got these names. If you say that they're empty names, then presumably the claims turn out to be false or meaningless or something like that.
So just real quick then, do you think that names are rigid designators?
I'm happy to allow that they are, but there's an interesting story to tell about empty names.
Sure, sure. Do you think that God could be a predicate?
Well, linguistically, it's not, right? Syntactically, it's not, right? I'm talking about the word God.
Okay,
it's
fine.
It's clearly a name. It's
yeah.
clearly nominal in its function. So, yeah. And when we come to analyze the arguments and we're going to treat them using kind of modern logical machinery, God's definitely on the name side.
But couldn't there be predicate nominatives?
You mean, for example, that you might say that goodness
like
exists.
Yahweh is God or Yahweh is divine.
So then the question is how you treat Yahweh, whether in that, if you've got something is divine, you might think that cleanliness is divine, right? So you could imagine that you've got some. Sorry, I picked a bad example, but you get the idea.
No, I do.
And then there's a different debate to be had now about whether there's something that cleanliness names, because there's a whole debate between nominalists and realists about
fair
universals. Enough. So, but in the sentence, I suppose you could suggest that there's some hidden nominalization going on, and there's a predicate, and then God is a nominalization of that predicate. The predicate, so it's more like possibly divineness or divinity exists, but that's not the way that these arguments are standardly formulated. Okay. I'm quite happy just to say, look, let the word God function as a referential term and say nothing about the category, right? Because I'm not committed to its being that God names something that's creaturely, right? That
very good. Very good.
Right.
I just wanted to get all that on the table because I do think that names are rigid designators. I'm not sure if God is a name in the way that Yahweh or Baal or Zeus are names. But for simplicity's sake, we can set all that to one side and just talk about the possibility premise a bit more generally. So, so I guess this is where I'll kind of at least begin to sort of make a positive case here. And again, I just, as a Christian, I would like to say a couple of things here. Number one, I don't think that people who disagree with me are necessarily thoughtless or ill-informed about these issues. I count myself extremely privileged to even have the opportunity to visit with you, Graham. And I am hopeful that somehow I can push this book through the internet for you to sign it for me, maybe at the conclusion of our discussion. But I will try to make a little bit of a positive case here. I'm something in the neighborhood of a virtue epistemologist, where I think that we come to know the truth by instancing particular intellectual virtues and avoiding epistemic vices. And I think that open-mindedness is one such epistemic virtue. And I think that when it comes to modal claims, there are three different attitudes that one can take towards any modal claim. One can either think that something is necessarily true. One can think that something is necessarily false, or one can think that something is contingent. Those are the three sort of doxastic attitudes that you could have towards any modal proposition. And it seems to me that if we're agnostic about something, if we're not sure, and we're trying to be open-minded, and I do think open-mindedness is an epistemic virtue, then I think the open-minded person ought to default towards the weakest or the most modest modal attitude that one could adopt towards a statement. So apart from a really good reason for taking one of these very strong postures to say that something is necessarily true, or to say that something is necessarily false, those are both extremely strong postures. The open-minded person should default towards just simple contingency. Now, with respect to the God question, that means that the agnostic inquirer who doesn't want to beg the question in either direction and instead just wants to be open-minded should default towards possibly God exists. Because to deny that possibly God exists is to say it is not possible that God exists, which is to say God's existence is impossible. That is a much stronger statement than to merely say God possibly exists. So I think that's where the open-minded person should start. And just to anticipate one thing that I'm certain that you'll say in response, because you brought it up in your book, one can certainly also say, well, then we run the reverse ontological argument. You say, possibly God does not exist. And I don't think that that is an objection that's going to get off the ground for several reasons that I'm happy to visit about. But just for starters, I think that the propositional attitude, the doxastic attitude that we would take towards these modal propositions is different in the case of positive existentials than it is in the case of negative existentials. So to say that possibly God exists is to say something that is a positive existential, whereas to say possibly God does not exist is a negative existential. So I think that just the virtue of open-mindedness would lead us to say, apart from an argument to the contrary, we should just default to possibly God exists. And if you think that's true, then the rest of the argument runs its course, and we know what happens. So anyway, there's just some food for thought that we can go back and forth on.
Okay, so it seems to me that if you think about modesty here and you compare possibly God exists and possibly God doesn't exist, right? Meaning in the one case, there's at least one world where God exists, and in the other, there's at least one world where God doesn't exist, that they're going to be on a par. There's no saying that one of those is more modest than the other on sort of independent grounds. And of course, we know, because we're assuming that either it's necessary that God exists or it's necessary that God doesn't exist. If God exists if we can find a world where God does exist, then God exists in all of them. If we can find a world where God doesn't exist, then God exists in none of them, right? So the kind of modest person, right, if we're now thinking about the agnostic is going to think, okay, these two are equally modest, and so I've made no further progress to enable me to decide whether God exists or God doesn't. That would be my response to what you said.
Okay, very good. So let me press back just a little bit then. I think that built into our very understanding of God, and that term, whether we understand it as a proper name or some other designator that refers, we've antecedently agreed that it doesn't refer to a contingent being, but it refers to a necessary being. So to say that there is a world in which God does not exist is a contradiction if you think that God is a necessary being, because then you're saying there exists at least one world in which a necessary truth is not true in that world, and that is a contradiction.
So when we say that God's what we agreed about, I thought, when we agreed that God's a necessary being, was what I said was the kind of missing premise in the argument. Necessarily, if God exists, then it's necessary that God exists. And that's true both if God exists in all worlds or if God exists in none. So it's an independent, necessary truth that we can agree to that doesn't move the doesn't give you any reason to prefer the argument that goes possibly God exists, add in that premise, so God exists, or possibly God doesn't exist, add in that premise, so God doesn't exist. It seems to me that the neutrality is undisturbed. Of course, there's the person who thinks that God exists also thinks that God's a necessary being in a different sense, namely actually exists in all of the worlds.
Right.
But in the kind of neutral sense of being a necessary being, all we meant was that conditional claim. And that's all that the properly neutral person should assent to.
Should acknowledge from the onset. Okay. Well, so then we have just a little bit further. It seems to me that there is a way that we can defend what a friend of mine named Chad McIntosh in an unpublished paper calls modal appears claims, right? So there's a way that modality can appear to us. This is similar to epistemic seemings. So it seems to me that thus and such, or similar examples.
Yeah.
So it's dark outside here in Texas, but I'm looking out in my backyard and there's an oak tree there. And I can say, well, you know, it seems to me that this oak tree exists contingently. Like I can imagine a state of affairs that's fairly similar to this world, but that oak tree is not there in the back corner of my backyard. But as I'm having that kind of experience, there is something positive that is appearing to me, like the nature of the tree itself. And there's something about it that strikes me as being contingent, that the tree itself is not a necessary being, right? But it doesn't seem to me that we would want to say that about God, especially if we have antecedently assented to the idea that if God exists at all, then God is a necessary being. Or to restate it in your way, which is a restatement of Hartshorne's way, necessarily it is the case that God exists necessarily, if God exists at all. So when I'm thinking about the tree and I say, well, the tree is contingent, so there's a possible world where the tree does not exist, I'm not doing the same thing that I'm doing when I say, it seems to me that it is possible that God does not exist. Because now I'm saying that there's this concept of God, which, if God is at all, is a necessary thing. And it also seems to me that there's a possible world in which this necessary thing does not obtain. That seems to me to not be a modal appearance claim, but instead seems to be the opposite, that there's a non-appearance claim. And that's not the same thing. I don't know how we would really think about what could justify any of those epistemic seemings in the way that I do seem to be justified or warranted, if you prefer, about there actually being something, the nature of the tree itself, that as it strikes me, it just strikes me to be contingent. There's nothing that I see about the tree that seems to be necessary, and certainly not impossible since it's right here in my backyard. So there seems to be a category difference between the way that we would talk about God as a necessary being versus something that appears to me and certainly seems not to be a necessary being. So how could anybody justify then the idea that it seems to them that there's a possible world in which God does not exist?
Okay, so a couple of things. One, this modal seeming talk strikes me as pretty odd. I mean, when I look out and when I look at all the things around me in the room, I don't think that, I mean, I'm convinced that none of them is a necessary existent, right? The batteries, the pen, the handkerchief, and so on. But that's because I know a whole lot of stuff about the world, and I know how things are produced, and
Sure.
right, and I know the same sorts of things about trees. I know how they grow. I know that the history of the universe, well, the universe is probably 13.8 billion years old. The Earth's about 6 billion years old. That tree might have been there 50 years or 100 years. It grew from if it's an oak tree, it grew from an acorn, right? Whatever. There's all this knowledge that I've got. There isn't some independent, I don't think, seeming of contingency. There's just a whole lot of background knowledge. So that's the first thing. Now, you may not agree with me about that, but let's put that to one side. The most secure kind of modal inference, I think, is the one that goes from it's actual to it's possible. So if you think there's no God, you think it's possible that there's no God, and that's how you get there. You don't rely on any kind of seeming claim. So if you're thinking about the two arguments, possibly God exists, so God exists, possibly God doesn't exist, so God doesn't exist.
Right.
And you're thinking about a neutral person, the neutral person will think, well, okay, if I was a theist, I would certainly accept that possibly God exists. If I were an atheist, I would certainly accept that possibly God doesn't exist. In either way, I could get there from what I think is actually the case to the possibility claim.
Right.
Right.
So
that's my answer to the, if you want to talk in that seeming way, the steps go, God doesn't exist. It's possible that God doesn't exist. So it seems to me that God doesn't exist. Something like that.
Okay. So just to dot our I's and cross our T's, there were some times that you used the word knowledge and know. There were some times that you used the word thinking, and there were some times you talked about beliefs. Now, I'm perfectly happy to think that at least for human knowledge, it's something like warranted true belief. If you disagree, I don't know that a whole lot hinges on this, but basically I hear you saying if one takes oneself to know that God exists or that God does not exist.
I wasn't thinking about it that way. I really wasn't talking about knowledge.
Okay,
I was just thinking about reasonable belief.
Okay, so if one reasonably believes that God does not exist, then one reasonably believes that
it's possible that
God does not exist, and therefore it seems to one on the basis of their reasonable belief that it's possible that God does not exist, on the basis of the inference from the actual to the possible. Okay. And if you would think that anyone would be a rational atheist on the basis of something like a reverse modal ontological argument, then certainly you would also concede that someone could be a rational theist on the basis of a positive ontological argument. But maybe you think that it is neither rational for the atheist nor for the theist on the basis of any kind of positive or reverse ontological argument to justify their respective belief about the existence or non-existence of God.
So that would be much closer to the case. So what I think is that, so simplifying a bit, that a theist is going to think that the ontological argument is sound, an atheist is going to think that the reverse argument is sound. That is, they agree that the relevant conclusion follows from the premise, and they think that the premise is true, the possibility premise, just suppressing the stuff about the other premises that you need. And if we think about someone who's genuinely undecided, they can see that were they a theist, they'd think this argument is sound. Were they an atheist, they'd think the other argument is sound. There's nothing in the arguments that gives them any reason to go one way rather than the other. And so I think, and this is kind of the important bit in what you said, the argument just doesn't give anyone grounds for accepting the conclusion. If anything, the kind of direction goes the other way. What premise you accept here depends upon what you think about the conclusion, whether you think that God exists or God doesn't exist. That's the way that I see it. I know that there are various ways that you can try to motivate having a completely neutral person accept one of the possibility premises and not the other. For example, Alex Proust had a paper a few years ago that tried to come up with some kinds of reasons for accepting that possibly God exists and so on. But I'm pretty convinced that those don't work. But of course, that's for further discussion now.
Yeah.
Well, this brings up an interesting question. Graham, so what is your definition of an atheist? I know that you wrote a book recently about this subject, but I wanted to hear you say it with your own words. What is the definition of an atheist?
Okay, so, well, it'll sound slightly provocative because we don't have the context here. So I think that properly we should define theism as the view that there's at least one God, and atheism is the view that there are no gods, and monotheism then as the view there's exactly one God, and we call that one God with a capital G. Atheists then are people who believe that there are no gods. And in particular, in our context, they believe that God doesn't exist. That's what an atheist is. There are other possibilities. There are agnostics, people who suspend judgment, so they believe neither that God exists nor that God does not exist. And there are innocents, people who, for whatever reason, don't have the concepts to formulate the proposition, so they just have no attitude towards it. So there's a kind of fourfold distinction. Other people like to say that atheism is just lacking the belief that God exists, which lumps together agnostics who, in the class of agnostics, right, with the class of atheists, if you define it that way, which I don't like. So I think that the right thing to say about atheists, so the right way, no, that's not the right thing to say. People use the words differently. I think that it works very neatly if you choose to use the terms the way I do, but not everybody will. But what I mean when I'm talking about atheists is people who say that God does not exist.
Is it fair, Graham, for me to say that those who self-identify as atheists and want to define atheism differently than the way that you suggest it should be, and instead along the lacking a belief in God,
yeah,
conflate the metaphysical theses with the epistemic theses? So the literal Greek, right? Gnosis, not knowledge or not belief. That. So, because I don't, theists don't call themselves, gnosists.
No, that's right.
And define those who lack such a belief as agnostics. So it does seem to me that someone who is an atheist is making a declaration, not just about their own personal psychology or their personal noetic structure or beliefs, but they are instead saying, I believe that in the entire realm of that which exists, gods are not part of that domain.
Right. So the history of the terms is complicated. So when Huxley introduced the word agnostic, it was about knowledge, right? It wasn't about suspension of judgment between two propositions. If we could go back and rewrite history and introduce the terms at the beginning, it would be much more convenient, because the way that the terms have grown up, there are people who, despite what you just said, that people who say, I want to proclaim myself an atheist, I lack belief in gods. And now I want to distinguish amongst the atheists between the strong atheists who say there are no gods and the weak atheists who just say, I lack belief in gods. But there's also the question about whether you lack disbelief in gods. too, because there are two poles here once we start thinking about belief. And so you end up, in order to identify all of the positions, I think the terminology is most simple and you get the kind of cleanest structure if you define it the way I do. But I'm not expecting that other people will necessarily adopt the way that I speak.
Yeah, nobody's well, I'm not going to put it that way. Well, let's do this. So to me, it sounds like the discussion right now, at least with respect to the possibility premise, we started out asking, like, what does the open-minded person do? And now we're talking about, like, well, the theist already sort of accepts it, that God is actual. And so obviously he's going to think that he's possible. So obviously he's going to think that he's necessary and exists. Same thing for the atheist. But let's go back to that agnostic person, this ideal agnostic, and ask what they should do in the situation. Should they just sort of, let me ask you, Graham, should that person just stay where they are? Like, because they don't have that belief in actually this way or that way. So what should they do? Should they just see the ontological argument and then just stay where they are?
So I'm supposing that they've suspended judgment, and it's not. So you can imagine people who kind of lean one way. I'm going to count them in that group. So I'm supposing that there are no leanings. This person is really an agnostic, and they're agnostic about whether God exists. So they should be agnostic about whether it's possible that God exists, right? Their position would be unstable otherwise. I mean, if they really have a leaning, if they think it's possible that God exists, but they don't think it's possible that God does not exist, well, then they're already a theist, right?
Could I ask a clarifying question about your understanding of that, Graham?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So in Bayesian terminology, would it be right to say that someone's credence level in the premise, possibly God exists, should be at 0.5, and also that the ideal agnostic, their Bayesian credence level with respect to the premise, possibly God does not exist, is also at 0.5?
Okay, so this raises some very tricky questions. And if you think that the way to do this is to say that the agnostic about a proposition gives exactly 0.5 to it, and the atheists are on one side all the way up to, depends whether we're going 1 or 0, depends whether we're talking about God exists or God doesn't exist, and the theist is on the other side going down the other end. But that might not be the best way to represent these positions, and in particular, it might not be the best way to represent agnosticism.
But why not, given that you just said that anything where it's not perfectly suspended would be to predisposed in one direction or another?
Well, suppose that that your credence runs from 40 to 60. So,
okay.
So from 0.4 to 0.6.
Very good.
It's now symmetrical, right?
Right.
And you might think that that's a kind of agnosticism that's not the strictly 0.5. Indeed, you might think that there's someone whose credence runs from 0 to 1, right? They're in, the whole interval is what characterizes their view. You might think of that as a kind of, in one way, a kind of uber strong agnosticism, or in another way, really weak, as opposed to the person who says that it's exactly 0.5. Right? That's why I said that it's not a straightforward matter how to think about this.
Yeah, and what the intrinsic probabilities of certain things are without considering other things is certainly a subject where there's a long literature on these matters. And I don't know, Richard has written extensively about this, as has another friend of mine named Callum Miller. But
yeah.
Some of Tim McGrew's work on intrinsic probability, when you're having to suspend judgment about these things in terms of Bayesian reasoning, is based on an important essay that John Maynard Keynes published, a very famous economist. And I'm still very confused about exactly how one should go about all those things. But it does seem to me, so I just want to press firmly but gently on this point. If we are talking about a truly ideal agnostic, not just someone who's, somewhere generic, but I mean the ideal candidate, then we would say that we've got these two mirror image premises. On the one hand, possibly God exists, and on the other hand, possibly God does not exist, right? And so with respect to the positive proposition, you could be zero. I have zero credence that possibly God exists, which would mean that you would have one with respect to the proposition possibly God does not exist.
Yeah.
And we could run the same thought experiment vice versa. So the truly ideal agnostic, which I don't think that this person even exists, but would be 0.5 with respect to both of those propositions. And if they weren't 0.5 with respect to both of those propositions, then even though it might still be reasonable to call someone an agnostic, it would also be true to describe such an individual as tilting in one direction or the other.
Right. So if you give probability 0.48 to God exists, then on the way that you've now set it up, well, you're an atheist.
Or you're at least an agnostic with atheistic tendencies, as opposed to
well, it depends whether you say you got to be 0.5 to be an agnostic, right? I mean, there is this other thought.
To talk about the ideal agnostic. I'm not saying this is the parameters of what you must be in order to properly count as an agnostic. I'm talking about the ideal agnostic for the purposes of our discussion.
Yeah.
But anyhow, I have a feeling that Cameron might have been wanting to lead the discussion a little further along some of these lines. So maybe we shouldn't get too bogged down here.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's all interesting, and I think we've teased that one out. I think as far, not necessarily as far as we can go, but we teased it out quite enough. So I know that Ben, you have a couple different ways that you like to support the possibility premise. So that was one way. What's another argument or consideration that's interesting in defense of that?
Let me just jump back to something that Graham said a moment ago, where he was talking about the fact that it's almost always the case that people start with whatever view they have, and then the ontological argument just helps them confirm their view one way or another. And I just want to let everybody know that I definitely think that is very much the case of what happens here. But I want to push back on that in one way, that I at least imagine that you could have the following state of affairs that obtains. Imagine you have somebody who just really hasn't thought much about the existence of God. Or maybe you have somebody who even has thought about the existence of God and is convinced that there is no God, but has been very unreflective about arguments for or against God's existence. And you might think of talking to somebody and encountering them and asking them, do you believe God exists? And they say, no. Why should I believe that God exists? And you just present the ontological argument to them, and they go, I haven't really thought about that. Possibly there exists a being who is maximally great and therefore exists in all possible worlds. Yeah, I don't know what I should think about that. Like, maybe, but it sure seems like everything hinges on this possibility premise. Like, why should I believe that it is true that possibly a maximally great being exists? And to that kind of person, I would want to say, well, there's the Kalam cosmological argument, the Leibnizian cosmological argument. There's the argument from motion. There's the moral argument. There's the teleological argument. Of course, at this point, we'll start going into other a priori arguments. There's the argument from numbers, and there's the argument from so many other arguments. And so they all kind of form a cumulative case for theism. And notice that every single one of the arguments that I just gave support the existence of not a contingent God, but a God who exists of necessity. So maybe you go through all those arguments and somebody finds them at least reasonable. They don't find them all ridiculous. And so they go, well, gosh, yeah, it sure does seem like it's kind of rational to think maybe God exists. And if you think maybe God exists, then it seems rational to think that possibly God exists. And so in this way, modal ontological arguments can kind of serve as the bookends to the argument from so many arguments, or to the cumulative case for theism. And so you start with the ontological argument, but it's unsure, and then you motivate the possibility premise by appealing to so many other arguments. And those other arguments for a necessary being, they don't push somebody to believe definitely that there is a God, but they believe, they would lead somebody to think that it's not ridiculous to think that it's possible that God exists. And then so you come back to the ontological argument and you think, yeah, I guess it is pretty rational to think that possibly God exists. And then you go, oh, well, now that I see that it is possible that God exists on the basis of all this other a posteriori reasoning, now I can run my modal ontological argument again. And so I would just suggest that that could be a helpful framework for understanding the dialectic. And so understood, it is not the case that the ontological argument plays no role in helping someone come to believe in God. Now, you could potentially say the exact same thing in reverse, right? You run a reverse modal ontological argument. It's possible that God does not exist. Well, why should you believe this or that or the other? And then you start running one of what Eugen Nagasawa calls the three types of arguments against a perfect being. Just briefly, the first type of argument is an argument that purports to show the logical inconsistency of some divine attribute, like omnipotence. And the paradox of the stone is the paradigmatic example of how you would purport to show the inconsistency of omnipotence. Or perhaps there's some second type of argument that purports to show the incompossibility of two or more divine attributes. So everyone has heard of this one. An omnipotent being can do just anything, including sin, whereas a morally perfect being cannot sin. And so it is often thought that it is not possible for one and the same being to simultaneously be omnipotent and morally perfect. And then there's a third kind of argument where there's some incompatibility between one or more of the purported divine attributes together with some contingent fact about the world. And the problem of evil and its various articulations is the paradigmatic example of that. So maybe you think about all that, those different kinds of arguments, and then your credence in the possibility that God does not exist is increased, and you run it the other way. But in either case, it is not the case for the theist or the atheist that the ontological argument or the reverse ontological argument plays zero role in helping those respective persons form beliefs about the subject matter at hand. It just depends on how they weigh various a posteriori arguments in the case of theism, or a posteriori and a priori arguments with respect to the examples that I gave for the atheist. So that's just a pushback on the idea that the ontological argument itself plays no role here.
So here's a worry about what you said. I worried that the move from maybe to possibly was illegitimate, because the other arguments that you're talking about aren't arguments that purport to show that there's some possible world where God exists. They're arguments about the actual world. They're saying on the basis of the evidence in the actual world, we've got reason to believe that God exists in the actual world. So if those arguments work and you're saying maybe God exists, you're not saying possibly there's some, there's some possible world where God exists. It's rather, it's a kind of epistemic thing about, okay, so I'm now unsure about how you weigh up all the evidence that there is in the actual world for whether there's such a being in the actual world. And that won't get you to the possibility premise in the modal ontological argument, or at least so you might worry. So that was a kind of first thought. There's a different thought which maybe kind of runs along similar lines, which is, suppose you consider the full suite of arguments for the existence of God. And by that, I mean, they have as their conclusion, God exists, right? And you're persuaded by the arguments and you form the belief that God exists, you'll certainly now get to the possibility premise by the kind of what's actual is possible route. But then the modal ontological argument won't actually be playing any work. So that I've got something else important I want to say, but let me give you a go on that response first.
Right. Well, I think that this helps us come back to something that we talked about earlier, just about how important it is that we avoid conflating different modalities here. So maybe God exists is sort of an epistemic modality, and to jump from that epistemic modality to a logical modality and therefore conclude, because it seems to me to be the case that maybe God exists, therefore there is a possible world in which God exists. That could be problematic. I need to think a little bit more about that. Having said that, you know, there's a long literature on whether conceivability entails possibility, and I'm rather attracted to the idea that people can be deceived about whether or not they are conceiving things. So, you know, the popular line that conceivability far outruns possibility, I'm not sure what to think about that. So if somebody seems to conceive of a possible world in which God exists, or maybe somebody would just think about the moral argument for God's existence, and they're not sure if objective morality exists in this world, but they could see that there's nothing that's a logical contradiction about there being a world in which God does exist, and maybe some version of divine command theory is true, then that would give them reason to think that there is a possible world in which God exists. And so then from there, that is a possible world that may or may not be the actual world. Maybe it's not them thinking that, oh, well, yeah, I can clearly see on the basis of this argument that the actual world is a world in which God exists. Again, I just want to put a maybe on this. This is tricky stuff, and it's stuff that I'm still trying to explore and work out a little bit. But that's kind of my rejoinder to that. You said you had something more important or another thing you wanted to cover.
So I wanted to say something about the way that you imagined that the reverse argument would go, where you kind of fill in the possibly God doesn't exist and then infer to God exists. And you said you followed Eugen Nagasawa's idea that there are kind of three ways the argument could go. But it seems to me there's quite a bit more, right? It's not just that you might pick a particular attribute and claim that it's impossible for it to be instantiated, or a pair of attributes or some tuple of attributes and say they can't be jointly instantiated, or that there's a kind of logical inconsistency between the attributes and some facts about the world. Because you might, for example, do the kind of thing that I do in my book, The Best Argument Against God, and think about the kind of the trade-off between simplicity and explanatory breadth and depth of the competing views, theism and some version of atheism. I prefer naturalism as a particular kind of naturalism as the candidate. And when you look at the trade-offs, you might think, well, you know, the naturalist view is a bit better than the atheist view, than the theist view. Given that the naturalist view looks a bit better than the theist view, surely it's at least possible that the naturalist view is true. And then, so there's no God, right? From the possibility to the actuality. So I thought that maybe the kind of reverse argument might have, you know, there might be more to it than you'd suggested.
So just to get clear on that, because you did touch on that in your book on ontological arguments and belief in God, and you touched very briefly on it in your book, Arguing About Gods. I'm sorry to say that I am not familiar with your book, The Best Argument. But shame on me for that. I should have been better prepared. It does seem to me that you're saying something like naturalism offers a simpler ontology that offers just as much explanatory power as theism. But how exactly is your view a simpler ontology? Because it has everything that the theistic world has, but doesn't have God as part of it?
Yeah, so that makes it simpler.
Yeah, but I don't think God is part of the world.
No, the world possible. So God's not part of the universe. World here is possible world. So remember, you started off by saying you characterize a possible world for every proposition, and that will include the proposition that God exists or that God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Right? So worlds. So this is a very common problem in these discussions.
It doesn't mean that it's a simpler ontology. It just means that theistic worlds have a proposition that is true, the proposition that God exists. But in all naturalistic worlds, the proposition is there. It's just not true. It's false. So it's not that naturalistic worlds are simpler because they have one less proposition in them, because the proposition is still there. It just has a different truth value.
Sure, but what matters is what you're committed to, right? Because what holding a particular set of claims true commits you to the existence of certain kinds of things. Holding the proposition true that God exists commits you to having God in your ontology, right? It doesn't matter what the ontological status is,
right.
Some generous category.
Sure.
The naturalist says God doesn't exist, and okay, you might wonder a little bit about how negative existentials work, but it's going to come out that the naturalist lacks the commitment that the theist has. So we have, roughly speaking, the same commitment to the natural world, but then there's this extra that the theist has. That's why the ontology turns out to be simpler.
Right.
That's kind of crudely the idea.
I understand what you're saying. I just from the get-go, we're going to have to agree to disagree. I think that theism offers far more explanatory power for all sorts of things than a naturalistic explanation is going to account for, particularly as concerns the existence of anything as opposed to nothing, the existence of the world as it exists, the existence of objective moral values, the existence of beauty, the existence of the fine-tuning of the universe, and particularly fine-tuning for discoverability. And here I've been very influenced by the work of Rob Collins. But again, you know, it's okay for it's okay for us to agree to disagree. It's not at all obvious to me that the naturalistic paradigm offers just as much explanatory power for a great many things which are rather uncontroversially true about.
Hey, I have a question real quick, Graham. Your idea that if you, for the naturalist, you have everything, that the theist has everything the naturalist has, but they also have God. And so therefore naturalism is simpler. I know that there's a response to this that actually was detailed in our one of the recent blog posts on our website by a guy named Dustin Crummett. He's a philosopher that wrote a series of blog posts about evidence for God, whatever. It's really interesting if you guys want to go check it out. It's on the website right now. But one of the things that he says about this argument is that if it worked, it'd also be an extremely powerful argument for solipsism, which is the view that only I or you, whoever's considering solipsism, exists. So what's your response to that?
So you have to remember that what you're trading off is simplicity against explanatory breadth and depth. So you could have a view that there isn't anything at all, right? That would be the winner for commitment, ontological commitment. It's got none. But you don't get to explain anything on that view, right? So that would be a kind of terrible view. You could also have a kind of view where for every sentence, every proposition, there's stuff that makes just that sentence true, and you end up with an incredibly very little explanatory breadth and depth, right? Because you just keep postulating new sui generis entities every time there's a fact to be explained. The good view is going to be somewhere in the middle. It's got to balance the two off. Solipsism does really badly on explanatory breadth and depth. Why do you have all of the particular experiences that you have? If you're a solipsist, you've got nothing to say. There's nothing to explain why you now see a computer screen and now you see a rubbish bin and so on as you look around you. So it explains nothing. It's a hope. So solipsism is going to be a really bad contender, right? It's just not a good view once you're thinking about trading off the two things. To go back to Ben's point, yes, there's a lot to argue about. That's the burden of my book. The best argument against God is to try to argue the cases, all of them, one by one, and to say why I think that there's a kind of draw. So to give you a kind of flavour to how this goes, in one case, the first case that you mentioned, so if you're the kind of theist that we're thinking about, you think that there's a necessarily existent God and everything else is causally downstream from that. And what explains the existence of God is God's necessity, and there's nothing that explains God's necessity, right? Necessity is just brute at that point. So I say, well, what a naturalist should say is that the universe begins with the initial singularity. It exists of necessity, and its necessity is brute. In terms of explaining why there's something rather than nothing, the two views are on a par. There's nothing that favours one over the other, because you've got a brute necessity in each case, and that's what does all the work.
Very good. Well, then I'll just turn the screws a little bit to the same thing that you put to me earlier. It seems to me that you don't have any contingency in your understanding of the world either, because it all just falls out of that singularity, which is brute and necessarily so. So there couldn't be any contingency that falls out of that.
Right, but there can if you allow that the evolution of the universe is chancy. So there's objective chance, and that gives you back contingency. Right, so there are a different variant. I mean, it depends what you want to compare here. If you think that there is actually initial contingency in God, because God can be disposed to create a different universe, then you could have some contingency in this initial setup as well. What matters is the existence is necessary, not whether its properties, in some sense, are necessary. And so you can map what you get to explain and how it explains between the two views in a way that gives no advantage to one over the other. That's my claim. So that's why I say that there's no, on that particular question, there's no advantage that accrues to theism. That's right.
Ben, let's get your thoughts on that. And then I did want to ask a question. We have one question about the Barkan formula in Modal. I think that's how you pronounce his name. But I mean, the conversation today has been somewhat technical at points, and so I'm completely happy with having a little bit of a discussion about that, because it is important in this context of ontological argument. So Ben, with a response to him, and then we'll talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So I just want to say that various philosophers and theologians who think about the nature of the divine being have talked about ways to resolve the necessity of God's existence with contingency in the world and avoid modal collapse. And there's lots of ways of thinking about divine agency, and lots of ways of thinking about God as actus purus. And I'm very happy with a traditional articulation of full bore classical theism. So I want omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, omnipresence. I want divine impassibility and strong understandings of immutability and timelessness and aseity and divine simplicity. I want all of that. And I think that there are ways of articulating some of those things within an Aristotelian or neo-Aristotelian metaphysics that avoid some of the problems that Graham is putting forward. And I just want people who are inclined towards theism not to hear these worries and then think, oh, well, there's no good way to respond to them. Unfortunately, just given our time constraints, we don't have too much time to go into that. And it might be the case that, the way that Graham wants to talk about chancy evolution and other things that are woven that somehow come out of this singularity that exists of necessity, maybe he could make similar moves. It's not something I've given a whole lot of thought to. But it seems to me that if it's a problem on the one side, it's going to be a problem on the other. And if it's not a problem on the one side, then it's probably not going to be a problem on the other either.
Right. And I agree 100% with that, because my strategy is just to argue that when it comes to explanatory breadth and depth across all of these areas, it's a draw. So if problems on one side are problems on the other, that's really just more grist to my mill. So the way that I want the argument to go, but I mean, people who are listening, theists who are listening, right, it's enormously controversial whether that argument could be made out. I think that it's sort of the most interesting atheistic argument. You know from other stuff that I've written that I actually don't think there are compelling arguments on either side, not even this one. But if you're going to look at an atheistic argument, I think it's the one that you should be worrying about. So
okay, so Cameron, just real quick, I want to try one more time on a positive case for an ontological argument. I just want to see what Graham thinks about this. Graham, please consider with me for a moment the entire realm of possibilia. Okay, yeah. So I have stipulated ex hypothesi that we are not concerned about anything that is in the domain of impossibilia. And we're only concerned about that which is possible, right? If you think that there's any kind of hierarchy of being, if you think that there is any manner by which some version of divine value commensurability obtains, where whatever the greatest thing that exists within the domain of possibilia is value commensurate with everything else that's within the domain of possibilia, and I think there's good reasons to think that's the case, why not just say that something is the greatest there, and that anything that is conceivable but greater than that, so here I'm just, for the sake of argument, granting that maybe we can conceive of things which are metaphysically greater, but they're impossible. Let's just say that we have reason to think that there's some upper limit. And whatever that highest thing is that's the upper limit, that's what the logical limit of maximal greatness is. And we've already stipulated in our discussion that we're only concerned about that which is within the domain of possibilia. So there's no question about whether or not it's possibly true. We've antecedently stipulated that. Now, all I need from there is to say that whatever that being is, it's possible that that being exists of necessity. And there's lots of good reasons to think that there are things that are necessarily true. You've stipulated that you think that the laws of nature are necessarily true, and that the laws of logic are necessarily true, and even that the singularity that quote unquote gave birth to the universe is a necessity. So given that you think that there are necessarily extant beings, there doesn't seem to be anything controversial about suggesting that whatever the greatest thing within the domain of that which is possible is itself something that exists of necessity. And without even stipulating anything about what the nature of that thing is, I seem to be able to run a pretty positive modal ontological argument and stipulate, therefore, that whatever the greatest thing is within the domain of that which is possible, it is possible that whatever that thing is exists of necessity, and if whatever that thing is that exists of necessity, therefore exists in the actual world. And there's absolutely nothing controversial about how do we know that what we're talking about is possible, because we stipulated ex hypothesi that we're only concerned with the domain of possibilia, and we restrict from the scope of our discussion the domain of impossibilia. Okay, so I think I'm probably happy with the idea that if we just think about all the possibilia, and we're a bit careful about what we say, how we're going to order them, that there'll be an upper bound, right? And maybe the upper bound will be ideal rather than actually instantiated in a world, but let's suppose that there is some upper bound. So we've got some way of saying for beings what's greatest, and let's to sort of fix ideas. Let's suppose that the greatest being, whatever it is, has to be a personal agent, so that because otherwise we might end up saying, well, you know, the greatest being is just going to be the universe, right? So what's you would think that conscious things are superior to unconscious.
Or something like that, just so that we get to that. Whether it's supposing that it's true that there's a kind of greatest possible conscious agent, the step to supposing that such a thing necessarily exists will actually be really controversial. Certainly it will be by my lights. So I'll tell you a little bit more about my theory of possibility now, because I've laid some of it down. I think that every possible world shares history with the actual world, and where it diverges because the chances play out differently. So you can think of it as sort of like a tree structure, right?
Like a multiverse.
No, it's not a multiverse, because I'm just talking about possibility, right? Chances play out a particular way, whatever, but they could have played out differently. That's where possibility comes in, because there's chance, right? So the two notions are related. I'm thinking that the greatest possible agent will be something a lot like you or me, right? It'll be an evolved organism with various capacities that are constrained in various kinds of ways. And
it's very kind of you to think so highly, but let me assure you that I'm nowhere close to what I think the greatest.
Yeah, right. But I'm assuming that the differences in the capacities of humans are kind of relatively small but something like a human being will be right at the top of this tree once we've stipulated that it's going to be conscious agents. And there's no reason to think that such a being could be necessary, right? There'll be different, way back in history, chances played out differently. None of us would exist, but there'd be some other bunch of conscious agents that exist, and so on. What you end up with on that way of thinking about what modal space is like will be perhaps a greatest being, but it won't be a god, and it won't be something that's worthy of worship, and it won't be something that's omnipotent, omniscient, and so on. You have to build in
that Adam West is not worthy of worship.
so kind of the point here is that you'll have to build some more stuff into your theory of modality in order to get it out that this greatest possible being is a god worthy of worship, omnipotent, omniscient, and so on. Sure. I don't mind the idea that actually there's, at least up until now, there's a greatest being. It'll be pretend that life didn't happen anywhere else in the universe, that it's not a multiverse, there's just this single universe where it'll be some human being, which one, who knows, right?
Well, yeah, there's definitely a lot more work to be done on the metaphysics of modality as they would relate to this particular ontological argument that I'm sketching. But I do think that it can be done, and I also think that it sidesteps a lot of the worries that are typically presented against the idea of an omniperfect being. You just say, okay, well, if as it turns out that an omniperfect being is not possible, then we ratchet it down to whatever level we enter into the domain of possibilia. There doesn't seem to be anything internally inconsistent or logically contradictory about a necessary being. So it does seem that a necessary existence is a perfection of some kind. It's a great making property. And so then you just affix that together with whatever the other maximal levels of various other great making properties. And we know from numerous arguments that perfections are all compossible. There are no perfections that are incompossible with other perfections. And so then you run your ontological argument along those lines. Here I'm thinking especially of a paper by a guy named Cesar Bernstein, who wrote a paper, Is God's Existence Possible? I believe it was published in the Haythrop Journal. And I found that to be a pretty compelling argument that all perfections are compossible.
So one thing, the general line that you're running now is very similar to the line that Yujin Nagasawa runs in his recent book.
I have some worries about the way that he articulates it, but yes, it is very similar.
And I have a review of it where I articulate some of my worries about it.
Oh, okay.
As well, but it's a very similar view. I'm also familiar with Czar's work as well. You pronounce it. I don't know when it's written. It looks
Cesar.
like Czar.
Yeah, it looks like it's Caesar, but it's Cesar.
Cesar. Yeah.
Now in law school. So.
Yeah. So I mean, there's lots and lots to say about that kind of approach as well, the kind of maximal but less than perfect being.
Sure, lots to be said.
So sort of less than maximal, less than perfect being theology, but nonetheless theology. I think it's an interesting approach too.
Well, we're about 10 minutes from the 2-hour mark, and we already started for Ben and I. And again, it's my fault, Ben. It all lies on me. But why don't we at this point, since we're very close to the end, let's just go ahead and get some summary thoughts of the discussion and sort of where we sit.
Was there a question from someone in the audience?
There was. I mean, there were tons of questions, but we're sort of up at the end of the time here. So, I mean, if you guys want, in your closing remarks, you can talk about the Barkan formula. I don't know how easy that's going to be in 3 minutes, but I don't know. I mean, let's talk about the Barkan for a few minutes, and then we'll do closings, and then we'll close it out.
Okay, so let me have a quick shot at this. So,
okay.
A kind of simple instance of the kind of general idea behind the Barkan formula is that you can flip the ordering of a modal operator and a quantifier and have an entailment. So necessarily for all x fx entails for all x necessarily fx, or necessarily for some x fx entails for some x necessarily fx, and then in the other directions as well, one's Barkan formula, one's converse Barkan formula. If you have both of them, the Barkan formula and the converse Barkan formula, it forces you to have a fixed domain, so all possible worlds have exactly the same things in them, and that doesn't look very plausible because it looks like there are worlds where I might not have existed, and so on. So in general, I think there are reasons for being skeptical about the Barkan formula and the converse Barkan formula when you're thinking about individuals across possible worlds. Maybe that's enough by way of starting the discussion.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say that I'm completely unfamiliar with this line of thinking. I don't have anything intelligent to add to the discussion.
Alrighty. Well, that was basically his question. If I can, I can try to scroll up there. But
I'll be glad to try to read a little bit more up on it. And
yeah, well, it's Madal's version, the modal perfection argument that he gives. But yeah, I obviously I can't comment on it either. Graham's the only one here. Did you want to add any more thoughts? I mean, you have some time there.
Not really.
Okay.
So not to try to say more about the about Madal's argument or the Barkan converse Barkan formula, except to say that the combination of those formulas is highly controversial. But then most of the stuff that we've been talking about is highly controversial.
Yeah, that applies to a lot. Well, let's go ahead and just give some summary thoughts of the conversation, and then we'll close it out here. We're actually doing pretty good on time. So why don't we start with you, Ben, and then we'll go to Graham, and then we'll close it out.
Yeah, so this has really been fun. And thank you, Graham, for being available. This is really special to me to be able to dialogue with you. I've benefited quite a bit from your work, especially your work on ontological arguments. And even if we don't see eye to eye on several of these things, I've certainly been helped in my thinking by reading your work. I do think that some of these certain articulations of modal ontological arguments can do more work than a lot of people think that they can. And if you're someone like me who thinks God exists, then you can infer, because you think God exists in the actual world, that it's possible that God exists, and then you run your existence argument, the ontological argument, and you find that God exists in all possible worlds, and that God has all of his perfections, essentially. And that kind of thinking can be very important in how you think through other puzzles in philosophical theology. And it's important to some of my work on open theism and trying to refute at least certain versions of open theism where God chooses not to know stuff about the future, or there are facts and God doesn't know them because it's impossible because he decided to create a world in which these facts obtain. I think those kinds of understandings of open theism are necessarily false, given the understanding of God as a maximally great being. So I think the kind of perfect being theology that is derivative of modal ontological arguments and the kinds of modal ways of reasoning about the divine nature are really important. And these themes present, even in people who are suspicious about whether the ontological argument is a successful piece of natural theology, it doesn't mean that the lines of thinking are worthless whenever it comes to thinking about other puzzles in philosophical theology. So the work of Tom Morris, the work of Eleanor Stump, the work of Al Plantinga plays prominently in how we think about some of these things. So even if you're not someone who thinks that ontological arguments are successful, but you're a theist, great, you can still make use of them. And even if you are not a theist and you think, therefore, obviously, that ontological arguments aren't successful, it doesn't mean that you should ignore them, because a lot of times you hear atheists talk about God and they say, well, I don't believe in God because your God's like this. And I often say, well, I don't believe in that God either, because that's not really an articulation of anything that's even in the neighborhood of what I think the divine nature is like. One final thing that I should just mention, and then I'll be quiet and let Graham have his final remarks. I do think that there's a very, very big difference between doing apologetics and talking about the existence of God by way of natural theology and doing the work of Christian evangelism. I'm one of those Christians who actually believes that Jesus Christ was God incarnate, that he was born of a virgin, that he lived a sinless life, and that he died a gruesome death, suffering vicariously for us, and ultimately died and was buried, and 3 days later was literally bodily raised from the dead, and that he shed his blood for the forgiveness of our sins in accordance with the scriptures, and was raised 3 days later in accordance with the scriptures. I believe all that stuff is true, not just that it's some fairy tale story that we tell, but that it's real, and I think it matters. And I think that telling that gospel to people is very different than trying to give philosophical reasons for why you believe that some God exists. Now, I believe that the God of the philosophers, the God of the modal ontological argument, the maximally great being, just is the same as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. But I think that we need to be very clear that when we're doing evangelism, it's not necessarily the same thing that we're doing when we're just doing natural theology or apologetics. So I don't know how to square up all those things very well, but it's something that I think a lot of apologists don't fully understand. And I want people, especially those who are interested in ontological arguments, to understand the distinction between Christian evangelism and natural theology from that regard. And that's something that I've been helped even in thinking about from some of Graham's work, just trying to think about the nature of God and whether the God of ontological arguments really is Yahweh or the God and Father of Jesus. So anyway, that seems like a good enough place as any to tie it off. Thanks again.
Okay, so what do I want to say in conclusion? So I can hear an echo. I'm not sure what's causing that. Okay, maybe it's all right now. So what do I want to say in conclusion? My view about all the arguments for and against, is pretty deflationary, I think, compared to most people's views. I mean, most people who are interested in arguing about the existence of God think that some of the arguments on one side or the other must be good. Whereas maybe because I set fairly high standards for success, I think all the arguments on both sides are unsuccessful. So I didn't have a particular stake in arguing that the modal ontological argument fails, and that you know, there were other arguments I wanted to bring in and say, look, these other arguments succeed. I think all the arguments end up in the same boat. But my reasons for thinking this are kind of more general, rest on more general ideas about what arguments can actually achieve. I think that for most of the arguments, the ones that are on either side that are valid, it's perfectly possible for, and indeed perhaps even required for people on whichever side it is, to suppose that those arguments are sound. But the kind of interesting discussion to have then is about the premises of the arguments and why we disagree about those. And so I'm much more interested in the kind of discussion about, okay, for example, is it possible that God exists, than as a kind of independent discussion, or more crucially, does God exist as an independent discussion, and then thinking about the various reasons that you might have for thinking yes or no, independently of whether you can sort of construct these arguments that have as its conclusion that God exists. I've been thinking about ontological arguments for a long time. I wrote a book on this topic a long time ago now. You kindly held it up before. I guess my view really over that time hasn't changed. I think the ontological arguments are kind of interesting in particular because in almost all cases, you can make a parallel argument for the conclusion on the other side. And then it's very interesting. There's kind of lots of intricate discussion about whether one of the versions is in any way better than the version on the other side. We saw a little bit of that in our discussion today as well. So let me conclude by thanking Ben very much for the discussion. It's been great.
Awesome. Well,
thank you for putting it together.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it's the ontological argument is a really, and Graham, you even admitted too, it's a really interesting argument. Even if you're not convinced by it, it's something that's really interesting, something that's fun to think about. And I'm sure that, I mean, that's why we still have 28, 29 viewers, live viewers right now. So even it's midnight over here, and it's even later on the which coast? It's too late. I can't think. Well, anyways, thanks guys for coming on. Graham, it's always a pleasure. We'll have to have you on again. I know that we're trying to schedule another one with you maybe next year. We'll have to see how your schedule permits. But Ben, always a pleasure to have you on. And if you guys want to help support Capturing Christianity, see more of these discussions, go to patreon.com/Capturing Christianity. You can donate there and help support us and get this ministry going so that we can have more of these important discussions. So, all right, we'll see you guys later.